Tonight's presentation is Spiritualism with Jack Kowiak. Jack is a retired market research manager from Eastman Kodak who enjoys researching and presenting material that he finds interesting. Jack speaks on a variety of topics to numerous organizations in the Rochester area, including ours, to whom he's presented several times over the years. In addition, he teaches regular classes at the Penfield Recreation Center. Jack's goal is to present programs that both educate and entertain, and I can assure you he's done that many times for our society over the years, and we always look forward to learning from Jack. And this tonight's presentation should be just like every other year's. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Drew. It's a pleasure to present to the Mendon and Honeoye Falls Historical Society. And my talk this evening is going to be about spiritualism. And I think I should start off by showing you some real photographs of ghosts. You always like to see real photographs of ghosts. Well, let's take a look at some. Well, I said they were real photographs. I didn't say they were real ghosts. Well, let's talk about spiritualism. What exactly is spiritualism? Well, if you look at a dictionary definition of it, it would say something like the belief that spirit component of individual survives after death. Well, that doesn't identify spiritualism very well as a separate religion, because you can go around the world and that's a belief that most major religions have. But they add to it. They say, and that it's possible to communicate with the departed. Well, again, that doesn't help us a great deal, because this concept of narration, spirit mediums, spirit possessions, shamans, ancestor worship, it's a very pervasive belief all throughout China, Asia, throughout Africa, throughout the Americas. Many religions share that. So where does it leave us in terms of trying to define spiritualism, in terms of does it differ from a lot of other religions? Well, it really comes down to this method of communication, how that's really happening. Because there's a very unique American approach that it took to the spirit communications in the 1800s, having to do with basing it in scientific rationale and the types of messages that were given. It wasn't just personal messages, it was social reform messages, and also the methods they used to talk to the other world. And the method that most people are familiar with when they think about spiritualism is the good old seance. And what I'll do is I'll play you a recording of an actual real live seance. Very famous seance, by the way. And this is the seance that is done on the anniversary of Houdini's death. He passed away on October 31st, Halloween. And on every Halloween, his widow got together with a group of fellow magicians and other friends to see if they could have Houdini speak to them through the seance. There were secret words, actually, that Houdini shared with his wife. That was going to be the code that they were talking from the other side. So you could hear this 10th and last seance they had on Halloween to try to communicate with the departed Houdini.
O thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please, manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible.
Well, that was the 10th one. The widow held these for 10 years after Houdini's death. And after the 10th one, she was like, Houdini, you're a great guy, but I have bigger fish to fry here. And then she basically stopped the seances. Now, some people, like Joe Skeptic, would say, how in the world did people believe in that stuff, right? Pigs fly. Well, a lot of people believe in that stuff. A lot of them did. If you look at the U.S. population in 1857 of 29 million, it's estimated that about 15% were spiritualist, which is quite large considering that Catholicism, which was the largest religious denomination at the time, was 23%. And given that most of the spiritualists were concentrated in the North, very few in the South, for reasons that I'll speak about later, the concentration of spiritualists in the northern states was much higher than 15%. Not only did a sizable portion of the population believe in spiritualism, but some very famous people did as well as followers. Arthur Conan Doyle, Horace Greeley, Go West Young Man, famous publisher, famous tycoon of railroads, Cornelius Vanderbilt, our own Isaac and Amy Post, the abolitionist, here in the Rochester upstate area, Charles Dickens, and Mary Todd Lincoln. So it was incredibly popular among many, many facets of society. And why was it so pervasive? Well, a series of reasons. Kind of came along at kind of the right place and the right time. Had a lot of its birth here in upstate New York, which was this hotbed for new thinking, new religious ideas, new social reforms, new way of thinking. People were very open to new ideas. And that manifested itself in just scores of new different religious tangents that were taken in upstate New York. Many different religions, as you can see around that circle, had their genesis or their growth right here in this area. So it was fertile ground. And also it was something that was meeting an unmet need, you could say. I mean, if you look at America in the early 1800s, it looks like a happy-go-lucky lot. But not everyone quite so happy-go-lucky. If you look at our typical person back then, they were concerned about a series of different things. One was predestination. That was a belief that was very popular in many Protestant churches, especially that came from a Calvinist lineage. And that was the idea that basically people are marked at birth that you're either going to heaven or you're going down to hell. And I don't care how good a life you led or what of a goody two-shoes you were. If you're on the wrong list, boom, you're going to go down to hell. So that was always a big concern to people. Also the concept of deism, which kind of came out of the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century. And that was the concept that God kind of did all this work to create the earth and mankind and all the animals and all this good stuff. And he gave man intelligence to kind of work out his own problems. And then it's like, well, see you later, God said, until you die. I'll see you at the pearly gates. And basically, you were supposed to use God's gifts of intelligence and reasons to work your way through the world. So it wasn't something that you could start praying to God or praying for his help and someone's going to intervene and help you in any way. You were kind of all alone. And of course, science versus religion. Science was booming, calling into question a lot of different things that were long-held religious beliefs. Here's something from a fairly recent Pew Research study. Generally think science and religion are often in conflict or mostly compatible. Even today, 60% of the time, almost 60% of the time, people felt they were conflict. What were they conflict about? Well, new scientific discoveries about the Earth, the origin of the universe, casting aspersions on different things in Scripture having to do with the Great Flood. Evolution was basically causing problems for a lot of religious beliefs at that time, questioning the existence of God. How could heaven be up in the sky when we know it's composed of stars and planets and such like that? So a lot of different conflict, a lot of questioning of traditional religious beliefs. People wanted to embrace science at the same time, but they're worried that if they did that, they were letting go of their belief systems. Spiritualism was different. Spiritualism was something that didn't run away from science. It was something where they ran and they hugged each other. And that was one of the big appeals. Because one of the founders of spiritualist thought was a scientist, very good and very famous scientist, by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. Had many discoveries in mathematics, metallurgy, geology, very esteemed as a scientist. Did a lot of inventing as well. Matter of fact, there's a little diagram of a flying machine that he came up with way back in the 17th century. Well, one of the things that he had later in his career was a series of very vivid dreams, almost trance-like, that he would go into during the day as well as the night. And in these dreams, he felt he was able to perceive the true nature of the universe. And he wrote, all that think that hell is the same for everyone, and heaven is the same for everyone, when in reality there are unlimited variations in either case. Hell is never exactly the same for one person as for another, nor is heaven. Just as there is never one person, spirit, or angel who is exactly the same as another. See, rather than this predestination thing where people were either allotted before they were born to go up to heaven or go down there and burn, instead, he saw heaven as a continuous improvement program. There's these big series of steps. And depending upon what kind of life you led, you could either go up on a high step if you led a pretty good life, or if you led a so-so life, you could be on a medium step, or if you're a real stinker, you'd be on one of the bottom steps. You could keep advancing up these steps. And there were these different spirit helpers type angel types who would mentor you and coach you along these steps to give yourself some improvement so be a better person and you could start advancing up these steps. And with the help of these angels, you would keep advancing. Even the stinker would eventually improve himself to get to the top step of heaven. Swedenborg also wrote, people do not believe they're in the company of spirits while living in this world. So these angels that are helping people on the steps are also accessible to help people in this world. So they could help people out so once they die, they can come up on a higher level. They don't got to be in the bottom level with all the stinkers, right? When in fact, as far as our deeper levels are concerned, we are continually surrounded by these spirits and angels. I have talked with spirits about the fact that people in the world do not believe they exist, and that scholars think people who believe in them are simpletons. The spirits themselves are heartsick over the fact that this kind of ignorance is still common in the world. So, pretty good belief system in terms of her concerns about predestination and deism. She's not all alone. There's spirit helpers that are not going to help her when she dies, but also on earth to kind of convince her. And also, this is something from science. A scientist is proposing this. Well, this got codified into a church of New Jerusalem, the Swedenborgian church, which started from Sweden, where Swedenborgia was, moved to England, and very quickly came to the United States. And if you wanted to learn about the teachings of this church, it wasn't very difficult as long as you liked apples. Yeah, if you liked apples.
The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun and rain and an apple seed. Yes, He's been good to me. so much for everything I see. I'm certain if it weren't for him, there'd be no apples on this limb. He's been good to me. Oh, here am I neath the blue, blue sky, a-doing as I please, singing with my feathered friends, humming with the bees. I wake up every day as happy as can be, because I know that with his care my apple trees, they will still be there. Oh, the Lord is good to me.
Yeah, that was Dennis Day from the old Jack Benny show, portraying the famous character in American history. And you probably know it, Johnny Appleseed, aka John Chapman. And John Chapman was actually a Swedenborgian minister, a missionary. And one of the reasons he went around with his apple thing was to basically preach this faith. He saw himself as a missionary from God, with his main charter in life not to plant the apple trees, but to use that as a vehicle to spread this faith. He was bankrolled by a fellow by the name of Judge John Young over in Philadelphia, who gave him a steady supply of these various pamphlets for him to pass out along his way, and whatever funds he might need to purchase orchards and other things on his way of establishing all of his apple farms and apple trees that he established all over the country. He was the main purveyor of the faith. The other kind of scientist that entered into it that added to the validity of spiritualism was Franz Mesmer, the German scientist who came up with this idea of mesmerism, which we now know as hypnotism. And he initially used it with some success, actually, in the treatment of psychosomatic illnesses. But he greatly expanded his ideas past that to the idea that it could awaken latent human powers, this thing inside people called animal magnetism. And this was a force of extrasensory perception. So he could hypnotize somebody on one room, and the next room could be another person and be almost like an ESP thing, that they'd be able to communicate together through this animal magnetism. And if they could penetrate walls, then they could also penetrate cosmic planes, like to communicate up to heaven. And Mesmer got into basically saying he was able to communicate with the spirit world, with people in heaven and angels and such, through this vehicle. And this was glommed onto by other people, especially Andre Jackson Davis, who claimed he used Mesmer's techniques in animal magnetism to really decipher more about what's going on in heaven. And he identified it in a particular location within the Milky Way. Yeah, he said there's a section within the Milky Way, and he had a map of the Milky Way stars, and he could point to the exact section that something existed called the Summerland Zone that was full of all of these spirits, good spirits that were all interacting together. And they not only interacted together, but they were interacting with everybody and everything on the earth as well. And they were there basically guiding things like when Darwin spoke about evolution, they were guiding all of that, and they were the guiding hand in all of that. He called it harmonial philosophy, harmonial sympathy, that these spirits from Summerland were interacting with everything on the earth to kind of guide it along in an orderly fashion. And this isn't a super original concept, because when you think of Eastern religions, they have concepts like the Tao and concepts like Dharma, which are very much similar to that kind of idea. At any rate, Jackson published this in something called The Principles of Nature, her Divine Revelation, and it was a huge, huge, huge seller. So a lot of her key questions are being answered in a nice system of spiritualism, in an organized kind of religion based on the latest science, right? You don't have science contradicting religion. You don't have science fighting with religion. All of a sudden, you've got science supporting religion. So you can kind of follow both paths with vigor. Continual progression of the soul after death with no hell. And also this universal brotherhood of mankind and the spirit, helpers and guides, that could help us on this earth day to day to day, addressing a lot of her concerns. Well, it was a very appealing theology, but it takes more than theology to make religions catch on big. It's appealing theology, but you need some kind of a wow factor, right? You need to grab the attention of the masses with this. And that came about and was done here in upstate New York over in Hyattsville in 1848 by the famous Fox sisters. They called their parents into the bedroom one day because they said there were these rappings going on. And they started doing these yes and no answers. And they went on and on and on. And sisters said, Mr. Splitfoot, that's what they call this mysterious rapping. Do what I did. And the one sister, Kate, went, and then they heard. And then the other sister went, and then they heard. And then the father went, and then they heard. Oh, well, they wound up doing this kind of coding, speaking, and they came up with this story, really, that what Mr. Splitfoot was trying to say, that there was a peddler that was murdered by the former owner of the house and was buried in the basement someplace. Oh, my goodness, it was a sensation all over the neighborhood. And word spread, and the older sister, Leah, came over to see what the commotion was. And once she found out about it, she moved the family over to Rochester and started setting up exhibitions with her two sisters and these rappings that were going on. And she invited the public and the crowd to ask questions where the two sisters could communicate with the spirits and give the answers through this kind of coded rapping, almost like a Morse code. And they invited many, many experts to examine the sisters before, after, and during the performance to make sure there was no shenanigans going on. And they brought in many, many experts through many, many performances, and they were all totally baffled. I don't know if anybody knows how they were really doing this. Well, originally, when they pulled the stunt with their parents as a joke, just to kind of spook their mother a little bit, they had an apple tied to a cord, and they were bouncing it on the ground with a string. But once they got into the stage show, they were doing something a little bit more deceptive and a little bit easier to hide. Have you had an uncle or somebody like that, and they were good at cracking their knuckles, and they'd be at a family reunion or some kind of party, and they'd be showing off how well they could crack their knuckles? Well, do you know you could crack more than your knuckles? Yeah, you could crack your toe joints really loudly if you practice it. And if you're wearing shoes that are kind of big and have wooden soles and you put those in contact with a wooden stage, it gets really, really loud and very difficult to decipher where in the world the sound is coming from. And that was the secret. Now, many other mediums jumped up. Florence Cook, who was famous for her spirit in the cupboard. Emma Britton, who besides medium was kind of the archivist of the early spiritualist movement. She recorded a lot of what was going on. Matter of fact, she worked to try to weed out what she thought were charlatans in the areas and fakers in the area. And then Cora Richmond, beautiful young woman, actually works out of Buffalo, New York. And she was interesting that she would talk a lot about scientific things that the spirits were telling her. Here's something that she said way back in the 1860s. Atoms are fully and absolutely empowered by the law of existence to develop all phases of physical life that are known. But atoms are not intelligent. No atomic structure contains within itself that which is the final source and cause of its organization. She actually had some remarkable insights into atomic theory before a lot of it was developed, but went on to say that there was a different world outside the atom that is this kind of spirit world. Now, spiritualism had a very strong overlap with women's suffrage movement as well as social reform. And you say, well, those seem to be odd bedfellows. Well, not when you think about it. Suffrage got very, very tied to spiritualism because it was largely a woman-led religion. The center of spiritualism was the medium. and the mediums were primarily all women. So just as men had the dominant role in most other Protestant religions in Catholicism at the time, spiritualism had its center women. They were accepted more readily as mediums and intermediaries since they were seen to have a more sensitive nature, which was more in tune with the spirits. And they will be able to provide mankind with inside information on the proper future path social reform. So many of the mediums were coming back and saying that the spirits are upset with the way women are being treated in society. There's second-class citizenship, so to speak. They're also concerned about slavery and abolition and things like child labor. And they were able to speak on very controversial topics and say very controversial things with impunity, because these weren't their opinions they were expressing. These were opinions coming from the spirits that were trying to help us guide us in this world. So it was a very influential as well as widespread platform for the ideas of women's suffrage and also different social reforms to get pleaded and make their case out to society. Many of the spiritual speakers had a very strong background in this. Lizzie Dozen spoke, she made a living as a medium, but spoke extensively about women's rights, about women's economic inequality, about the moral inequality between men and women, that men were taking mistresses and stuff and women were shamed by that. Amanda Theodosia Jones invented the vacuum canning process and employed a large factory in upstate New York entirely of women, but she also acted as a medium as well. And there was the famous Victoria Woodhull, a medium and the first woman to run for president of the United States, a very strong spokesman for women's rights, not only locally, but in Washington, D.C. as well, nationally. Now, all of this wasn't just random stuff that was going on. It was gathered together in periodicals, these different spiritualist newspapers, where they were gathering up the different sayings and different teachings of all of the various mediums, what was going on, and summarizing it in these various periodicals that were widely disseminated. So you can see how it could be, and it was, the fastest growing religion of the mid-19th century. If you look at all those religions that I listed that were coming about in upstate New York, the fastest growing one in the 1800s was spiritualism. Not only in the United States, and it really took off in the United States after the Civil War. After the Civil War, people got very concerned because they had so many different family members that were killed. They were very concerned about communicating with them. They wanted to make sure they weren't burning in hell, right? And so there was a big spike in spiritualism after the Civil War. And this spread not only to the United States, but many other countries as well. There were very strong spiritualist communities in England, France, Italy, Russia, South Africa, and throughout the Caribbean. Now, when you look at seances and spiritualism within the 1800s, this period that I'm talking about now, and there's been a lot of stuff written about fake seances and all this other kind of stuff. The reality was that 90% of spiritualism, these seances and such, was really private things that were done in a home among family members or close relatives. And it was religious in nature. It would always generally start with a prayer and end with a prayer. And it was a fairly mundane thing that really didn't involve spirits speaking back to them, but basically them sending messages to their dearly departed, you know, wishing them, telling them what was going on, wishing them well, and such like that. When many sociologists and psychologists have kind of looked back on this phenomenon, they don't see it as necessarily an unhealthy thing in society. They see it as a somewhat healthy thing because it was giving comfort to the bereaved, because the concept of predestination caused a great deal of angst for someone who had lost a loved one. Because not only did they have the grief of their loved one was no longer with them, but they had the added grief and worry about their wonderful Antillia, or whoever it was, might be burning in hell. As a wonderful person she was, she might be burning in hell. And basically having some kind of feedback, as phony as it might be, from a medium was very reassuring and kind of took that piece of burden of grief off the individual and helped them grieve kind of more in a normal process. Now, there were many theatrics and charlatans. The bigger the religion got, the more opportunity there was for that kind of fakery. And one of the most common things was spirit photography. It was founded by a guy by the name of Maumre, started it out, where he kind of discovered this, what you could do with double exposures. And he would charge people between maybe $100 and $200 to come, and he would ask them to bring some kind of images of the loved one so he can get a better feel for them and such. And he would run these double exposures. And I'll show you some examples of them. Maumre was actually taken into court, and he had to stop his practices. They couldn't throw him in jail. They didn't have quite enough evidence for that. Later on, actually, to be honest, he invented the process for printing photographs on newsprint and newspapers. And he was the guy who basically enabled newspapers to start having photographs and print photographs. But there were other things besides spirit photography. And one of the most famous things you'll see in these different seances and such like that is this concept of levitating a table. And it wasn't a difficult trick to do. I mean, if I have a table and I wish to levitate it, and I put my hands, oops, give me a second. I put my hands, I don't know if you could see it. See my hands on top of this? I could just levitate it. So I could levitate this. Not grabbing, I just have my hands lightly on top. What's not difficult to do, if you've got little sticks up your sleeve, and you place those underneath the table. Or you have a stick or something attached to your waist or what have you to kind of grab a hold of the table and levitate it. The Davenport brothers were very, very popular. They would have a big kind of cabinet on stage with a bunch of musical instruments in it. And they would have somebody tie them up, just like a Houdini kind of thing. Come out of the office and audience and bound them up as tight as you can with ropes. And then they would close the cabinets, and then all of a sudden they'd call upon the spirits to play all of those instruments, right? How do they do these kind of tricks? Well, what you have to do is, like, for example, there's a picture of that accordion. Now, see the buttons on the side of the accordion? I want everyone to count the number of buttons that are on that accordion. And once you correctly count the number of buttons, whoever gets to it first, the accordion will start playing itself. Start counting. Accordion sounds a lot like a harmonica sounds a lot like accordion. And the brothers were just quite good escape artists. They did a lot of the kind of Houdini tricks where they would kind of tense their muscles so they were slack in the rope and they were able to get out of that. And they got out and they had various different ways of sneaking around and playing these different instruments. Usually when there's a seance, and actually when I do this presentation live, I always, at this portion, I turn out all the lights because I do all of these things in the dark, just like the spiritualists had. You have to use your imagination, but very often they'd have something where they were going to be touched by a spirit. So it would be very dark. And how would they touch people with a spirit? Well, you get yourself a nice long pole like this with a little touch rag on there. And if you got a big, big, big long one, you could reach all the way across the room. And I could be talking to someone across the room and touch them many, many feet away. Now, people wised up to these type of tricks. So the spiritualists had to be a little bit more clever. So they would say, well, you know, we don't want you in the dark going around doing stuff. So what we'll do is we'll all put our hands on the table. And you touch my hands, okay? So you know my hands are right here. I can't be up doing all this stuff. Well, a common trick the spiritualists would do is when they went to touch hands, they would bring their hands real close together like this, right? And people would touch them on other sides. And then the spiritualist would sneeze, cough, adjust his chair for a second, and then it would be black, and he'd put his hands back and say, well, come touch my hands, touch my hands. And it'd take the two people beside him, and it'd have their touch their hands together. So they thought they were touching the medium, and then he's free. Or if he didn't have enough space to do that, he'd have at least one hand, and he'd have his other hand free to play a harmonica or use his little touch device to do various things. You want to see an actual spirit? I've got one. Brought one with me. There it goes. Oh, there's my spirit. Oh, my poor balloon. Yeah, generally they would have some type of helium-filled balloon. Now, in those days, helium was not well known. People weren't aware of that kind of floating thing. So to see something floating was amazing. And they take one of these things and they paint it up with phosphorus paint, so it would glow in the dark, and put a mask on it. And you'd have this little thing kind of floating around the room, all lit up, just amazing people. It was flying before, but unfortunately, when I brought it out in the cold, after it got filled up with helium, the cold did a number on the helium. It doesn't want to fly anymore. Well, all of this chicanery came to a head. And so they finally had a commission out of Philadelphia called the Seibert Commission, where they called in some experts and brought in to examine some of the most prominent mediums and to reveal them basically as fakes. Henry Slade, who wrote on these little slates, spirit writing onto slates was his famous thing, and they found out a variety of tricks he was using. Generally, when they would have the spirit write on the slate, what they would do is they'd take the slate and they would hide it with their thumb under the table so the spirit could write on it, and then they'd bring it out. Well, what Henry and other people would do is once the slate was under the table, they'd have a Confederate and a trap door come up and switch slates, write something on the slate. Or they would do something just like the old kind of trick where he goes to put the slate under the table and then he adjusts his seat or sneezes and he switched the plates. Or they had different tricks where when they held it under the table, they put a little thimble with a little piece of chalk on his thumb and he could write on the slate. He had a bunch of different tricks doing it. James Mansfield was another cupboard person that they revealed, doing a variety of different chicanery, especially with levitation. He had these different kind of hooks that he could go onto his belt, levitate different objects. And Margaret Fox herself fell on hard times, became an alcoholic, and in order to earn money, went on the road with this big kind of confession, confessing to everybody how her and her sister did all the tricks, the way they snapped their toes and all of this other kind of stuff. Later on, she recanted because she wanted to go back into the medium business, but she went out and did this. So all of this kind of confession and public stuff really started to cause a decline in spiritualism throughout the 1880s. But just as the Civil War caused a big bump in spiritualism, when World War I started and all of these people had these deaths from the soldiers, there was a big increase in spiritualism as well, following and during from the World War I all the way through the 20s. And when spiritualism got to this phase, the charlatans got much, much more sophisticated because magic got much, much more sophisticated in terms of the tools and such that magicians would use. And these mediums were able to basically kind of order some very extensive and sophisticated type fooling devices. There was actually a catalog from a company in New York called Gambles of Ghost, and they advertised various different things that mediums can purchase. There you can see an advertisement there for a spirit wrapping table for $50, which was quite a bit of money back then. This is particularly for mediums who have their own apartment that is easily used in any room where the table can be placed. In appearance, it is an ordinary, finely finished library table. It'll bear minute scrutiny, it won't be seen. It can get as many wraps, and there's this very elaborate mechanism in there to generate the wraps. Another advertisement for a telescopic reaching rod. Very often when they wanted to do the things like touching somebody or having something move, they would have small little things that are 6 inches, but they could telescope them out really quickly to like 3 or 4 feet and do different things around the room. And various masks and different things that they could use with phosphorus. And of course, this required more skilled investigators. There were a series of different magicians, famous magicians that were doing these investigations, including Houdini. And it shows Houdini himself, but Houdini worked a lot through Confederates. He had a sister and also some other people that he hired to go around and basically go to the mediums and gather information to kind of expose them. Now, as Houdini and the other magicians started revealing all of the different tricks, they had to rely upon different types of things as spiritualism advanced. And they got more into where they didn't have to use any type of devices. They got into things called cold reading techniques and hot reading techniques that really are extensively used to this day by psychics and mediums. So for example, there was crossing over with Jonathan Edwards, and he was very big on using cold and hot reading techniques. Hot reading techniques are something that basically you have prior knowledge. So a long time ago, what the mediums would do is if they knew someone was going to come to them for a reading, they would send somebody over to scout this person out, right? Talk to their neighbors, talk to their friends, look up stuff in the newspaper that was written about them, go to the birth, death records at City Hall or the church to look up information. So when they came in, they'd find out about it. Well, Jonathan Edwards also used this technique. So what would happen at many of his seminars and stuff that he would give, he had Confederates that would go out into the lobby. And when they had his sessions, they always had something where, you know, people just didn't go in right away. They would let the crowd in all at once, so people were always gathered in some big area in the lobby. And his Confederates would circulate among these different people, and they were quite good at what they did. I mean, they'd come up and say, oh, you know, I'm anxious to talk about, you know, the passing away of my nephew. I really missed him. I don't think people understand, you know, what it's like and how hard it is sometimes when you lose a loved one so close to you. And of course, the person talked, well, you know, I know what it feels like because I lost so-and-so, 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 right? So all of a sudden they talk and they got a line on this person. So they go to sit down, and this Confederate wouldn't sit right next to the person, but it would sit kind of nearby, you know, a few seats away. And Jonathan Edwards would kind of spot the Confederate there in the crowd. And so the Confederate, they would be set up with hand signals, right? So this would be father, this would be mother, this would be aunt, this would be uncle, this would be a brother or another sibling or something like that. And depending upon the hand signal that the Confederate was getting sitting there, he might say, oh, someone right in this area here recently lost their brother, right? Oh, yeah, you know, that was me, right? And so, and then he'd have a series of clues, other things they give out, like how old the person was, you know, based upon maybe how that Confederate would touch, where they touch on the arm and such. So he would mix the hot read stuff in with cold reads. And cold reads are something where you don't have prior knowledge of the person, but you got an awful good chance of somebody answering your question. Like one of Jonathan, what it was, I see eyeglasses, right? Well, if you look at the percentage of the population using eyeglasses by different ages, you look at this chart, by the time you get up to 55, close to 80% of people are wearing eyeglasses, right? And so when somebody passes away, you got these eyeglasses in the house, and for most people don't just throw away eyeglasses. They kind of keep the eyeglasses around because they spent a lot of money for them, and you're wondering if you got to give them to the Lions Club. So if somebody recently passes away, it's just safe bet to say, "Oh, I see eyeglasses. Oh yeah, I got these eyeglasses there from my school." One of the ways you could really improve your odds is you don't have to go to a particular individual. You could say somebody in this section among these 2 or 3 people, right? Because if it's 78% for one person, by the time you get to multiple people, you're way up there, right? Percentages. Also, it's based upon observation of the poll. So the median has somebody that comes in and they look, and it's kind of a older gentleman, maybe like past middle age, maybe my age or something, and they look, and there's no wedding ring on their finger. And they observe that, so they say, the spirits are telling me, I'm sensing you had relationship issues which sometimes that leave you fearful of the outcome. Well, somebody of that age with no wedding, good chances they might be divorced. Maybe they thought to themselves, "Oh, I should have married very soon when I had the chance." They can't do that now, right? Someone that age is older, right? So chances are good that their parents or some other relative had passed away. So they can say, "I sense sadness over the death of a family member or friend over the last couple of years," right? Chances are good you're going to get a hit. Or they give very general clues where it's tough not to say no to or find an answer, right? I see the letter H. Does this mean something to you? Okay. An older person, possibly female, but it could be male, right? With an M in the name, right? Mr. So-and-so, an aunt for that, right? Either an aunt or a close family friend. You cast such a broad net. It's easy. And then what you do is once you get the person hooked a little bit that you got something right, and they're starting to believe you, you throw the burden back on them to justify it. So you say something and they're struggling to kind of answer it, and then you say, "I'm getting such a strong signal. Are you sure? Really think about this. The spirit will relay information to me in mysterious ways, so it's up to you to make the meaning out of things that I'm telling you." These techniques have been used back in the 20s when they were doing that, and they're used to this day. Spiritualism never really left. I mean, it morphed into the religious belief of theosophy, and that morphed into many New Age religions that popped up all throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I'm sure you've heard people a long time ago, like Shirley MacLaine, right, talk about channeling, past lives, and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, Lilydale was a kind of modeled after the idea of the Methodist type of Bible camps, somewhat similar to Chautauqua. They formed their own, which is kind of like this summer camp thing. Actually, there was a place next to them called Casadega, not far from Lilydale. And a bunch of people migrated down to Florida, and they opened their own kind of Lilydale, and they call it Casadega. There's another spiritual camp down in Florida called Casadega. And spiritualist churches exist all around. This spiritual church is right here in Rochester. And in fact, there's 2 of them. One by Vic Park and this other one. And what's a service like in a spiritualist church? Well, it looks a lot like a typical Protestant service. I mean, they have prayers and they sing songs and they have a sermon. And the only really difference is towards the end, they'll have a medium come up that will basically talk to the congregation in terms of what the spirit world is telling her that she wants to relay to the audience. Many countries, it's still big around the world, especially in Brazil. There's estimated to be over 12 million spiritualists there in a very prominent spiritualist church that is one of the largest religions within Brazil. And of course, we see it day to day in different types of TV shows and famous movies that are big bestsellers with this idea. And it'll probably always be around for as long as people are wondering about the same questions that they were worrying about way back in the late 1800s. Science versus religion, what happens to me when I die? Is anybody watching over to me? As long as people are asking these questions, I think some type of spiritual belief and participation will probably always be a room. Well, thank you for listening to my presentation about spiritualism. I think we could stop the recording now, and we'll open it up to
My
questions
audio.
from the audience.
Start video.